Before I get into today's episode, let me tell you about the Friend Zone Docuseries. The Friend Zone Docuseries is a podcast that explores the many dimensions of the social world through topics such as friendship, dating, marriage, and navigating close relationships. How should someone deal with rejection or disappointment? What does it take to be confident when putting yourself out there? Have you ever had the pain of unreciprocated love? All of these things really suck, but it's okay. The Friend Zone Docuseries is there for you to help you navigate all of life's very strange and complicated challenges. Follow the link in my show notes to find them on Acast today or wherever you get your podcasts. We love a good vigilante, don't we? Crusaders for the greater good, often covered in unique and creative costume, dashing through the shadows and snatching up evil doers before the evil can be done. We love characters like Batman and Spiderman because they protect the most vulnerable people from the most dangerous predators. But they're just fiction, right? What if I told you that the world had a Batman once, and he was a lot more complicated than the caped crusader we know and love? My name is Josh, and this is Obscure History. It's true. The world had a Batman at one point, but he wasn't a handsome billionaire hidden behind high-tech gadgets and armor. In fact, he was the opposite. He was from a poor family in a working-class town. Jonathan Wild was born sometime in the 1680s in Wolverhampton, Staffordshire, England. His parents were hard-working country folk, his father a carpenter and his mother an herb merchant at the local farmer's market. At the time, Wolverhampton was Staffordshire's second largest city. Despite its size, it was still a predominantly blue-collar city with most jobs existing in the ironwork and mining industries. Very little is known of Jonathan Wild's early years, save for these facts. He was born in Wolverhampton. He would eventually have 4 younger siblings. He was educated at the free school in St. John's Lane, where he learned the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. He eventually became the apprentice to a bucklemaker, and he was married in his late teens. But those are just the facts. If we give any credibility to the pamphleteers of the day, then we could also speculate that his father was a bottom-rung criminal lowlife. That, while at the free school in St. John's Lane, he developed keen penmanship, which would assist him in later endeavors. We could also speculate that he was born with some sort of horrible disfigurement, maybe a facial abnormality that caused him difficulties, or maybe a hip that didn't quite fit into socket properly. If we are to believe these pamphleteers, then we might also think that he learned to pop his hip out of socket on demand to avoid military recruitment. Or possibly that he learned how to convincingly fake a limp from the traveling thespian crew that he befriended. Point being, sources on Jonathan Wild's childhood are scarce and vary wildly in their accounts of his life and character. We can only really start tracking his life with accuracy after he left his wife and child to move to London as the servant to a lawyer named Councillor Daniels. This arrangement didn't last long, though, as Wild was released from his duties shortly after arriving in London. His next job was a bit more intense. After his release from Councillor Daniels' employ, Jonathan Wild found himself as a setter, employed by the Marshalsea Court. Setters had a particularly loathsome and undesirable job. Essentially, setters were tasked with searching out debtors so that they could be arrested by their employers. This job was often achieved through extremely unethical means, with bailiffs using force up to and including murder to capture their targets. It is said that after finding this new form of employment underpaid and disproportionately dangerous, Jonathan Wild sold his horse and returned home to Wolverhampton. He went back to his life of mundanity, making buckles, being a husband, raising a child. For 4 long years he did this. For most, this life is exactly the goal. Find a partner, raise a child, get a stable job. What more could you possibly ask for? Well, Jonathan Wild wasn't most people, and this life of simple country existence just wasn't enough. He once again skipped town, abandoning his wife and child, and headed back to foggy old London town to try and find fortune and adventure. Unlike his last stint in London, where he was employed by a debtor's prison to find those with outstanding bills and bring them to face their day in court, he was instead himself a debtor, and was subsequently locked away in a debtor's prison for 2 years. He was in a particularly difficult situation during this time, as London's prisons were highly corrupt and prisoners were often required to pay bribes for their freedom. And as a newcomer to London, Wild didn't have friends to bail him out or money to soften the hearts of his captors. After working tirelessly, most likely taking on jobs that other prisoners refused to do, or by using the skills he acquired as a setter, he did earn enough to pay for his freedom. He also earned the ability to leave the prison at night to hunt down thieves and other minor criminals for the jail. In one sense, he was kind of like 17th century London's own Batman, a shadow lurking through the alleyways, stalking the criminals and wrongdoers. But on the other hand, he himself was a criminal, and was only cleaning up the streets as a way to lessen his own punishment. This would prove to be perhaps the most consequential time of his life. During his prowling, he met a lady named Mary Milliner, who was a well-known sex worker. The two struck up a professional relationship. Mary knew London's underworld, and Jonathan was trying to learn it. She taught him everything he needed to know about the rising tide of crime in London, and he started offering her protection while she went on her night walks. After earning his freedom in 1712, Jonathan Wild, rather than returning home to his wife and child in Wolverhampton, moved in with Mary Milliner, and the two took each other on as spouses in a marriage of the least legitimate type. The two lovebirds would enjoy a sort of Bonnie and Clyde romance, two criminals soaking up the drama of crime and passion. Jonathan Wild decided that it wasn't enough to simply seek out and bring criminals to justice. After embedding himself in the criminal underground, he realized that there was simply too much money to be made in crime. So he started dipping his toes into the water of ill-begotten gains. At first, simply by fencing stolen goods for people he might very well beat to a pulp and turn into the police the very next night. Mary also decided to change her lifestyle a bit. During this time, she got off the street herself and started employing younger women to do the dirty work for her. She was no longer a street-level sex worker and was instead a professional madam. Jonathan played a dangerous game. He brought criminals to justice on some nights, and on others used the money that he earned from fencing to pay bail for the thieves that he had likely put in jail himself. And in the early 1700s, London was a hub of crime as it was exploding commercially. There was certainly no shortage of targets for Jonathan Wild and his elaborate ruse. In fact, Wild got so good at this gambit that he was picked up by a man named Charles Hitchens, who was running the exact same scam, but on an official scale for the courts. Charles Hitchens introduced Wild to the profitable world of thief-taking, which offered a reward of around $6,000 in 2022 currency for each thief turned into the courts. For a while, the two had a very lucrative partnership. However, after Hitchens was released of his duties in 1714 for corruption, the two parted ways and would eventually become bitter rivals. You see, Wild would make it his personal mission to eclipse the legacy and fortune of his mentor. But before we get to that, we need to stop and pay our own debts. So hang tight. After about 90 seconds of ads, we will be right back with the thrilling conclusion of this tale. Jonathan Wild eventually amassed a large enough fortune to employ his own band of ruffians, which only increased the efficiency and deviousness of his organization. Wild's scam was genius and, indeed, nearly foolproof. He and his gang would steal goods from unsuspecting victims, keep the stolen goods, and wait for the theft to be announced in the newspapers. At this point, he would claim that his thief-taking agents had found the stolen merchandise and that he would return it to its rightful owners for a small nominal fee, which was essentially marketed as a delivery service. In some cases, if the stolen items or circumstances allowed for blackmail, he did not wait for the theft to be announced and would instead negotiate the return directly with the victim. Most nefariously, in addition to recovering these stolen goods, Wild would offer the police aid in finding the alleged thieves. However, the thieves that Wild would turn in would be rival gangsters or men from his own crew who had crossed him in some way. The true genius of this scheme, however, is that he didn't necessarily have to commit serious crimes to earn his fame and fortune. He never sold the stolen goods back to their owners. He simply turned them in for a reward. He never mugged anybody. But he knew everyone who had mugged somebody and could turn them in at a moment's notice if he so chose to. He had everyone under his thumb, and if they stepped out of line at all, he would apply pressure to them until they felt that they may burst. And in some cases, he did push until they burst. By his own admission, he would send the records of thieves in his employ to the gallows if they stepped out of line. And in that same document, he claimed to have done this over 60 times. He was considered an upstanding citizen, doing good work to prevent the growing epidemic of crime by the general public, and even some elected officials, while simultaneously being one of London's most notorious crime bosses. And he did this by treading a very fine line between doing the crimes, being involved in the crimes, and being privy to the crimes. Wild publicly presented a heroic face. In 1718, he called himself dramatically the thief-taker general of Great Britain and Ireland. In 1720, Wild had gained such a reputation that the Privy Council consulted with him on methods of controlling crime. His recommendation was that the reward for evidence against thieves be raised. Within the year, the reward was raised from £40 to £140, which contributed to a nearly 200% increase in profits for Wild and his gang. One of the most powerful tools that perpetuated Wild's reputation was the obsession with crime in the press, particularly their obsession with theft. Wild himself would approach the papers with accounts of his falsified heroism, and the papers passed these on to a concerned public. Perhaps the most incredible example of this comes from a 1724 report that Wild apprehended 21 members of the Carrick Gang, hauling in a reward of over $100,000 in 2022 currency. When one of the members of the gang was released, Wild pursued him and had him arrested on further information charges. To the public, this seemed like a relentless defense of law and order. In reality, it was cold-blooded gang warfare disguised as public service. Wild would also use the press to toy with his victims. In one notable instance, he posted an ad in the local newspaper that read, "Lost on the 1st of October, a blank chagrin pocketbook edged with silver with some notes of hand. The said book was lost in the Strand near Fountain Tavern about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. If any person will bring aforementioned book to Mr. Jonathan Wild in the Old Bailey, he shall have a guinea reward." It may not be apparent, but the Fountain Tavern was a brothel, and by offering a nominal reward for the return of this book, he is threatening the original owner. By stating that there are notes written in the book, Wild is really telling the public that he knows the identity of its owner, and he knows that the owner has been visiting the brothel, so in order to ensure that he actually gets the reward, he publicly blackmails this poor individual. It's the kind of genius that should make your skin crawl. It's devious, and wicked. But it worked. Nearly every time. For a while, it seemed as if Jonathan Wild was on top of the world. And frankly, he very nearly was. He was quickly earning one of London's most envious fortunes. He had worked out a nearly impenetrable plan, and he didn't intend on stopping. However, his schemes would be foiled by another criminal from a working-class background. The conclusion of this tale is meant for a big-screen summer blockbuster. But it's also meant for next week. Join me next week as we unravel the thrilling conclusion to this tale of crime and punishment. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. I sincerely appreciate it. As you may have noticed, I am still playing with the sound of this show. I don't exactly know if I'm going to keep it. It is highly frustrating. Maybe my laptop is just getting old. I don't exactly know. I bought a fancy new microphone and like some really awesome monitor headphones, and so everything should be sounding better. But alas, here we are. Also, I hope you enjoy this sort of format that I've taken on here in the new year. I didn't necessarily intend to do this, but breaking up larger episodes into 2 smaller parts is very helpful for me, and I think that it tells the story in a better, more engaging way. I could have probably wrapped this up in one 35-minute episode, but at that point, I'm not sure that I, as a one-man crew, have the capability of making that into something that is of the quality that I hope that you've come to expect of me. So I like to do it this way, break it up. It gives me a chance to work on the script and the sound design a little bit more. So if you like it, please feel free to write in obscurehistorypod@gmail.com. If you don't like it, also feel free to write in. That's fine too. I am a crew of 1 here, so I will absolutely see it, and I will most likely respond unless you're extra mean, and then I probably won't. If you'd like to reach out in any other way, I would sincerely appreciate it. @allthepeoplepod on Twitter, because that's just, they won't let you change your username on that platform. Also, I've been recently posting some links to some of my fiction. I don't really exactly know what else to do with it, but it lives there if you'd like to see it. Obscure History Podcast on Instagram, because it does let you change your username. And I guess there's a Facebook, but I don't check it because Facebook is toxic. As always, this episode was brought to you in part by Earbud Podcast Collective and Indie Drop-In Network. If you are looking to expand your catalog of podcasts that you listen to, check out those 2 services. They are invaluable. They are extra valuable. I don't know if that was the right word. It's past midnight right now, so forgive me. They are incredible services. Ariel and Greg are 2 of the best people in the business, and if you go check out their services, I'll put a link in the show notes. You will not be disappointed. Speaking of links in the show notes, I am working on a very, very big deal behind the scenes, and you will probably, hopefully, find out about it at the very beginning of next week's episode. Until then, I hope that you have a wonderful week. I'll talk to you next week. It's very late. Thank you for listening.